This is System Crash, a weekly tech news show willing to tell the hard truths about how tech and the titans who own and operate it is really transforming the world. I'm Paris Marks.
And I'm Brian Merchant.
This system has just begun to crash, so support the show by heading over to patreon.com/systemcrashpod, where you can sign up to get monthly bonus episodes. Also, rate the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This week, we're joined by two fantastic guests to continue digging into these aspects of Silicon Valley and everything else that are happening around us with Elon Musk and many more. Annalee Newitz is a journalist and author of Stories Are Weapons and the upcoming book Automatic Noodle. Charlie Jane Anders is the author of the upcoming book Lessons in Magic and Disaster and writes a newsletter at buttondown.email/CharlieJane. They are the co-hosts of the Our Opinions Are Correct podcast, and it's great to welcome them to the show. Annalee, Charlie Jane, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's so great to be here. Yeah, I love System Crash. It's one of my favorite podcasts right now.
Same.
So nice of you to say. And we've been planning this sort of, mind meld for a little while, or we've been hoping to have it happen. And we've been doing this little series, Elon In Power, kind of looking at how this man sort of arose to the position he's in today, to command so much power in the halls of the U.S. government, and where sort of his thinking comes from, where his power comes from. He may not always understand or seem to understand the science fiction that he references, but he wants to make it very clear that he is a big science fiction aficionado. It's a big part of his identity, right? Like, it's a big, very blunt force sort of element in the way that he conducts himself. He's naming elements of his companies, his businesses, his children after sci-fi icons.
Just like he really wants to prove he's a big gamer too, right?
Oh,
right. Yeah.
It's so sad.
He's like, in a weird way, he's appealing to an idea of geek authenticity, which is exactly what he would hate. Like, it's a kind of woke geekhood that he's claiming.
You know, I just want to start off by saying that, like, Paris, in your other podcast, Tech Won't Save Us, you did a 4-part series on Elon Musk that, if people haven't listened to it, go back and listen to it. It's required listening. I just ate it up. It's so good. But also, you know, Annalee and I used to do this website called IO9 about science fiction, and we just wrote about science fiction all day long. And the thing that I learned from doing that is, you know, there's multiple levels on which to interact with science fiction. You can, like, interact with the text and really kind of think about the text and kind of, like, really, like, live and breathe the nuances of the story. Or you can consume it as memes and, like, fandom and shout outs and Easter eggs and, like, nostalgia for, like, just vague images. And, like, some people really just want to interact with science fiction as, like, a set of signifiers, as a set of nostalgic kind of memes. And that's totally a legit way to interact with it, but you're not necessarily going to be getting as deep an understanding of what these stories are. And I think that when you look at some of these powerful people who reference science fiction, they're only referencing the memes. They're not actually thinking about what the stories mean. Like, Elon Musk is like, oh, it's like in Hitchhikers where the computer is like 42, but he doesn't stop to think about what that story actually is saying about computers, about the meaning of life. He just is like, this is a funny meme. And so a lot of it is on that level, and it makes it frustrating to talk about because you can't treat it as like, this is how they're interpreting this story. They're not. So that's just what I would start out with. Sorry, that was very long-winded.
Can you unpack that specific example? Because I have seen that one come up a lot too, for those who aren't familiar with Hitchhiker or that meme.
Okay, I'll do it really quickly because I feel like I'm monopolizing here. In The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is probably it's definitely one of my formative books by Douglas Adams, there is this whole storyline where a group of aliens created the Earth as an experiment because back in the past, they created this computer, I think it's called like Deep Mind or something like that, or Deep Thought, to answer the question of what is the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. And the computer comes back with the number 42, which is this sort of inherently absurd, kind of Kafkaesque, Stanislaw Lem-esque, basically saying that trying to, like, find the meaning of life is an absurd pursuit in itself, and that there's no such thing as a meaning of life. But then the computer is like, well, you need to find the question that answer goes with. So they create Earth in order to find the question. And in the end, Earth gets destroyed right before it's going to come up with the question. It's complicated because there's this part at the start of the book where there's a woman who kind of comes up with this great insight for, like, how life could be better and we wouldn't have to nail people to crosses anymore and all this other stuff. And you think, oh, is she the person who's actually going to have come up with this question? But in the end, nothing really ever comes to anything. And it is kind of this, it's actually an attack on the hubris of people thinking that they can figure out the meaning of life or thinking that they can build a computer to answer these big questions questions. It's kind of poking fun at Isaac Asimov, who had this thing where like they built a computer to answer the meaning of life and it becomes God. And in Douglas Adams' thing, they build a computer to do that and it just becomes useless. And I think it is kind of poking fun at that hubris. And what people like Elon Musk take away from it is like, oh, that hubris was awesome. And it's what we should aspire to, because it's not even that he misinterprets the story. He's not interpreting the story at all. He remembers a meme that was a funny meme. He may or may not have ever read the book or seen any of the adaptations. I have no idea. But he's not actually engaging with the text on any level. He's engaging with the memes based on the text, is what I take from that.
I would jump off that to say, I do think there's a level of interpretation that's going on there, but the interpretation is, as Charlie Jane was saying, partly it's extracting memes from a narrative, which is to say, turning something which is contextual into a series of commodities, basically. I mean, it's a way of taking a little chunk out of a story and imagining, well, what if this was a product? And I think that's the mistake you see Elon Musk making and lots of other leaders in Silicon Valley who look at science fiction as like a plate of things that they could monetize. Mm-hmm. And as a science fiction writer, I've often been invited to conferences where I'm invited to, interact with people who are developing products in Silicon Valley. And what they want to know is there anything in any of the books that you've written or stories that we could turn into a product? And it leads you to the classic torment nexus issue where it's like, okay, yes, there's a bunch of products that you could create. You could create the computer that says 42 when you ask what the meaning of life is. But the point of the story isn't the computer. It's all of the social meanings and economic meanings around that. So I think that is a form of interpretation. It's just the most brutally capitalist interpretation that you can
just extractive.
Exactly. Like, how can we pull something out of this? But the other thing I've kind of come to realize about Elon Musk specifically is that he is drawn to narratives where oligarchs have lots of power. And I had always said, he doesn't really understand Ian M. Banks's Culture series because he doesn't realize that these are really about like sort of radical socialism. But he does get it because there's all of these characters who are super powerful capitalist robber barons, basically, who will like own a planet and turn an entire planet into like a substrate in order to run a version of Christian hell, which is actually the plot of Surface Detail, which I highly recommend people read.
It also feels like what they're trying to do these days. Like
it is. And I fear that is like the end goal for Meta is like, we will build a place to upload your brain and torture you forever for being gay or being non-binary or trans or whatever. So I guess what I would say is I totally agree with everything you're saying, Charlie Jane, but I do think it's also an interpretation. It's just the wrong interpretation.
Even if he's just using it as a meme on X or whatever, it's still commodified. Like, it's just, he's not interrogating again the meaning. He's just saying 42 or whatever. He's like, it's like a laugh line that he can wield sort of as clout and to sort of play to this fan. And he doesn't ever have to stop and sort of question that. And I really like that you brought up the Culture series, because that was widely seen online, like as that moment where he was like, this was years ago, I think, when he was like, I love Ian Banks, and everyone's like, Ian Banks would have hated you because he was a trade unionist. And it felt like at the time that was like a big burn against Musk. But you're right. Like, he's like, I don't care. Like, I can take what I want from it, right? Like, I'm on the way to becoming the richest man in the world. I can do with these ideas and memes what I see fit. And he has.
And that's the thing about fiction, is that it is intended to be interpreted in multiple ways, right? If a story is really rich and well put together, like, you should be able to come out of it with multiple right answers about what it means. But I still want to claim that there are some wrong answers. There's many right answers, but like, there's also wrong ways to interpret it and wrong ways to encounter it.
I feel like what you're talking about as well, the type of approach that someone like Elon Musk has to it, it brings to mind the story that was in Walter Isaacson's biography of Musk, where they're talking to him about the Cybertruck and, kind of future Tesla vehicles. And he's just like, the future needs to look like the future, which is apparently something like one of his sons had said to him. And it's not like, okay, what is going to work as a product? What is going to be appealing to people? What is actually, something good to have on the road? It's like, I watched Blade Runner and I watched Back to the Future, and I want to make a vehicle that is going to look like this because the future is supposed to look like this thing that I saw in these movies. It is the meme in the way that you're talking about, right? And not thinking about anything beyond that. And then, of course, the product totally bombs, and anyone who had a brain could see that coming from a million miles away. But it's still like, it needs to look like the future.
He always says that the future should look like the future.
Yeah.
And I would love to hear both of your takes on this, because it's like one of his sort of calling card things. But of course, like, look like the future as he sees it, of course, like as his adolescent brain sort of hardwired certain ideas about the science fiction he enjoyed in the 90s or late 80s or whatever. To him, it's a very narrow vision of the future that he's saying products and the world, and to some extent our social systems, should look like. So what do you hear when he says that?
I hear a lot of eugenics in that statement. Actually, it is about an aesthetic. Of course, it's about a science fiction aesthetic, but it's also about science fiction from an era when almost every story featured a cis white guy as the hero. And so I think one of the things that really has destabilized people like Elon Musk, not just him, but like a whole generation of people, is this idea that, oh, maybe the future won't look exactly like me. Like maybe industry leaders of the future will be Black, or they might be non-binary, or they just won't look like Elon Musk, and they won't look like the people that he grew up with. And so I think the future should look like the future is almost like saying, yeah, I saw a bunch of movies with like white men in like really cheesy looking like vector graphic trucks. That's what it should be. And it's not just about the Cybertruck. It's about the white man who drives the Cybertruck. That's who should be in charge in the future. And we got to make sure that happens. And if we're going to make sure it happens, then we need to be doing things like creating Doge, like take a meme, a cute meme, and like turn it into this like blunt force instrument to eradicate any mention of non-cis white men from positions of power in the United States.
I think in general, we are in danger of like having our actual future be devoured by like past visions of the future and nostalgic visions of the future and retro futuristic visions. And I think that there's a bunch of trends that all kind of smush together in my mind, from Hollywood increasingly doubling down on just like recycling the same old IP and trying to pander to Gen X baby boomer sensibilities and like things that people really liked in the 70s and 80s. We're getting another Tron movie, which, why are we getting another Tron movie? I don't know. Tron has never been a popular franchise, but we're getting another one for some reason. So there's that. And then there's, somebody was commenting on this earlier, like this week, and it really blew my mind, the idea that like all these AI, like ChatGPT, like all these generative AI things can only recycle past texts, and like this idea that we're just going to endlessly remix and recycle texts that have already been written, and that's what is going to be new culture from now on.
That's the future, Charlie.
The future is the past remixed. I do think Annalee's right that some of it is nostalgia for a time before we were asked to, have any kind of inclusion of anybody who doesn't look like Elon Musk. But I think it also is just, there was a moment in the 70s where the sort of space age started to end. We stopped going to the moon. We had believed that we would be colonizing other planets like any day now. And then we started to realize, colonizing other planets is actually quite difficult. There's like cosmic radiation. It's actually quite difficult to bring that much mass, that distance to like Mars or any place further. Mars is actually not hospitable to human life and probably won't be for a very long time. This dream that we had of like the space age kind of petered out. And that was when these escapist narratives like Star Wars started to take off. And now we're at a point where rehashing the rehashes of the rehashes of those escapist narratives that we started cooking up when the space age ended. Someone like Elon Musk, part of how he rose to prominence was by saying we could have the space age back, which I thought was a wonderful, like I was like, hell yeah.
Me too.
And like I still think SpaceX does a lot of good stuff in between all the creepy space junk that we're now covering the entire planet with. There's a lot of good that SpaceX does, but I feel like we keep being promised, we're going to return to the age of like the space age and like innovation and stuff. But instead what we get is nostalgia for past visions of the future. And that's really the takeaway that I get from a lot of this.
It's to the point where it seems stunted. And, there's been sort of cultural commentators who, like, there's a book, Retromania, a while ago. It's the whole capitalist realism is sort of a product of this, like, inability to sort of imagine futures. And, even I was, like, sort of skeptical that this phase would last so long. And maybe it is kind of in tandem with a certain sort of men, like, gripping power and sort of exporting these visions and shoving them into our faces for so long and making them inescapable. And obviously the entertainment industry is in the grips of people who are very obsessed with the IP reboots and endlessly recycles. I mean, there's great work being done in science fiction communities and people writing, like independent sci-fi novels, and there's so much fun stuff and good stuff coming out. But does it feel also that, like, it's harder to break through on a larger scale when we have something like X, this giant platform that's controlled by a man with one-dimensional science fictional tastes and a culture that's entrenched in certain ideas? It does seem like there is kind of like a cultural hegemon that is retrograde and destructive in a lot of ways.
It's complicated. It's hard to summarize all of that, everything that's happening in culture. What I will say is that there are a lot of really positive, great visions of the future being created right now. There's been movements coming up in science fiction, like hope punk, solar punk, you name it, like stories that are about futures that are radically inclusive, that are environmentally sustainable. Becky Chambers has done some great stuff. I've been reviewing a bunch of books lately for the Washington Post, which are like actually really positive, uplifting visions of the future, but they're not retro-futurist. They're not the nostalgic visions of the future, and they are not centering only white men. I think in terms of like breaking through the hegemon of like when Twitter became X, it became harder for a lot of science fiction creators to promote their work, for sure, because Twitter had been a place where we could do that, and it's not anymore. I hear people complain about that all the time. I think science fiction book publishing is doing great. That's the thing. You don't need to reach 1 million readers to be a successful science fiction author, thank goodness. It's great. It's just maybe not Star Wars popular. It's just, there's a lot of stuff that people in the science fiction book world are talking about that's amazing. It's just, it's its own world.
How is the science fiction community sort of interacting with this moment? Or like by and large, what has been the response to like Elon Musk and the rise to power and his appropriation of all of these tropes?
It's diverse.
Very diplomatic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just using a forbidden word. There's obviously elements of the science fiction world that are very conservative, right? There's always been science fiction writers who participated in like helping the military industrial complex, like imagine the future. And like like Larry Niven being a great example of a guy who did that and remained very prominent within the science fiction community, even as he was like working with the military. So I think some people are fine. They're like, great, this is awesome. We're getting lots of money from working with these people. And at the same time, of course, we're trying to push back like in the community. And it's hard because as these radical changes are taking place in the early days of the second Trump regime, a lot of us are being threatened with economic precarity in ways that we haven't been before. And lots of science fiction writers are also civil servants, or they're also like teachers and librarians. And so most of us don't make a living just from writing. And so people are feeling really threatened and scared. At the same time, I think there's a general sense that like there's a fire being lit under our collective asses, and that we need to be providing visions of a future or an alternate present that help people think their way out of this morass of propaganda. Because I think we forget that propaganda is also a form of science fiction. It's like a fantasy overlay on top of what's happening and on top of what should happen in the future. It's hard when there's a very powerful set of science fiction stories about vaccines and about DEI and all of this stuff. Like you said, it's hard to break through and be like, actually, here's another story. But I think it's the best way. I've been saying for a long time that instead of trying to directly respond to the science fictional propaganda coming out of the Trump regime, instead of saying like, I'm going to refute that point by point, that we just say, nope, we're going to just tell a different story. That's one kind of science fiction. If you want to buy that, go for it. But I have something else to tell you. It's something about how community actually can be a powerful force for making the world more livable. Like Charlie was saying, we have solar punk, we have all kinds of other ways of talking about the future. I wanted to put a a tiny bug in people's ears about is that oftentimes we hear that science fiction is the only form of speculative fiction that can help us think about the future. And right now, there's a lot of fantasy writing that's helping us think about the future and helping us think about the present. And romantasy gets a really bad rap because people think anything that's romantic is like silly or frivolous. If it has sex in it, it's kind of, oh, that's not part of the revolution. But if you look at, like, say, Rebecca Yaros's series that starts with Fourth Wing, which I feel like in a lot of like lefty circles, people were like, oh, this is military and it's romantic. We hate this. It's actually a powerful anti-colonial narrative. It's all about revisionist history and how revisionist history is toxic. And it's about the main character learning to be on the side of the oppressed people in the narrative. Sorry to give you a spoiler, but like, but these are like, and that's a powerful, powerful story that is getting into the hands of tons of young people. And it's giving them a way to critique what's happening to them right now. It's giving them a way to talk about what's happening when books are taken out of their libraries. And I saw Rebecca Yarros at the National Book Festival, and she said openly, like, I wrote this book because I was pissed about revisionist history. And like, she lives in the South, and she's like, my library was being raided by Moms for Liberty, basically. So she's aware of it. So I think that we just need to remember that good storytelling and hopeful, helpful stories about how to turn back the tide of propaganda, they don't always come from some like fancy literary science fiction. They might come from the romance shelves in your bookstore or from like romantasy TikTok. Don't poop on those things just because they're silly.
Or we think them silly, because those books are huge, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just read a couple of great books that are kind of about trans people standing up against tyranny. One of them is this book, Awakened by A.E. Osworth, and it's about a group of trans witches who fight an evil AI, and the AI is like catfishing them and like doxing them and stalking them and doing basically all the terrible online things that trolls do. And they have to use magic to defeat this AI and like outsmart it.
Was the AI a form of grok by chance? Like,
I mean, it's not explicitly, but yeah. Anyway, and also Notes from a Regicide by Isaac Fellman is about like a trans people who have to fight an evil tyrant 1,000 years in the future. They sort of have to fight him. They have to deal with him. It's complicated. It's not like quite so clear cut, but I don't know. There's some great stuff out there right now. And those are both April 2025 books. I feel like we're actually really lucky that there's a wealth of great science fiction.
We're getting so much environmental science fiction too, like where there's Premi Mohammed in she's Canadian and she's written just a ton of great
her stuff.
Books. And yeah, and like she has a background in environmental science and she weaves that into her storytelling. And Malka Older has an incredible series of cozy mysteries set on Jupiter, the Massa and Pleiade series, and they deal again directly with the aftermath of some kind of shitbird like Elon Musk trashing the earth and telling everyone, why don't you move to Jupiter? Hey, it's going to be great. And of course they get to Jupiter and they're like, actually, we really want to figure out how to get back to Earth. Yeah, this kind of sucks. I mean, it's nice, but it's like, they'd like also to have Earth.
Right.
Yeah, there really is a new crop. Like Charlie Jane was saying too, there's a huge crop of books coming out right now that are by trans and non-binary authors that are questioning a lot of the current propaganda in this country. So it is weirdly an amazing time for science fiction that's radical and subversive, but it's also an amazing time for propaganda that's right-wing and oppressive. So we're like stuck in the middle.
This conversation had just reminded me also of Charlie Jane, your great story, The Bookstore at the End of America. Anyway, I just wanted to plug that one too. It's very pertinent to all that we've been talking about in a fun volume called The People's, I read it anyways, and it's also in, I think, your own collection, but also in The People's Future of the United States.
Oh, well,
it's a great collection.
Yeah, fun collection.
I'm still very proud of that story. So I was just going to say that, returning to the question of like, I feel like there's something very seductive, and I find it very seductive, this idea of like these kinds of quote unquote optimistic stories about how we're going to fix everything, about how AI is going to just be this miracle that's going to like save us, about how everything is just going to be great and we're going to just turn into like cyber people living in a cyber world. And
upload our brains.
We're going to upload our brains. We're going to turn all of space into a substrate for our consciousness. Like Annalee actually talked to Nick Bostrom about this, and I'd love to hear Annalee talk about that in a second, but it's very seductive. I would love it if those stories were true, because it would just be so nice if we could just like have unlimited rice pudding forever, to kind of misquote Doctor Who. The easy kind of like free get out of climate change card, get out of like all of our other problems card that these stories offer us. And it's very seductive. It's very like alluring, like this kind of Nick Bostrom, Elon Musk, Sam Altman view of the future in which everything is just going to be wonderful and we're going to fix everything because our technology is going to just be so great that it's going to just lift us up, literally uplift us. But I think that the role of science fiction, good science fiction, is to question these easy narratives and to show how nothing good ever comes without struggle. Nothing good ever comes without people actually working together and building alliances, rather than just like, oh, we built the perfect computer and we said boop, 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 and it just fixed all our problems and said 42 and then we were all good. I would seriously love to hear Annalee talk about like Nick Bostrom and how...
Yeah, me too. Me too.
Well, I was going to say two things. I mean, it is true. I interviewed him many years ago for a book and asked him about his hypothesis that what we will do is turn all of the universe into a substrate for our minds. And I said, like, doesn't that seem like we might be stealing mass from other people to do that? Like, I don't know. We don't know what's out there. And he said with a completely straight face, there's no evidence that there's any other life in the entire universe. So it's ours. And, you know, that's in a nutshell. That's the extractive principle at work, right? Like if it's out there, it's ours. Who cares if there's somebody living there? It's our matter. We're going to use it for our own consciousness.
We don't need to think about it any further than that. It's
there's no evidence.
We call dibs.
Very much like the Final Frontier vibe, like the whole colonial kind of fantasy of space is like right there embedded in it.
Virgin territory.
Totally.
Yeah, for sure. But I was going to say the other thing that's so interesting about the AI will fix it narrative is that part of the fantasy is that AI is going to create more art and writing than we've ever had before. And we've seen, I mean, I think we've all seen Silicon Valley leaders saying things like, I can just ask ChatGPT to write me the perfect novel that's like exactly what I want to hear. You know, I can say like, I want it to have sexy robots and flying turtles and like be set on another planet. It's interesting because what that does, because one of the things that art does and writing do is bring people together in community, right? They allow us to speak to each other, even if we're separated by great distances or great time periods. We can still hear words from people 100 years ago or 400 years ago. With AI, of course, we create the perfect way to turn everyone into little monads that aren't connected to each other because they're only talking to the machine and hearing from the machine. And there's no connection made. There's no solidarity possible because the only person you're ever talking to is this manufactured, recycled. Recycled is too nice because like recycling, we want to have a positive spin on that. But it's like this kind of extracted information from dead people. It's like the ultimate dead labor. It's just like we mushed up all your dead labor and now we're feeding it to you.
Not only that, but while all that's happening, like the working artists, working writers, maybe not directly, maybe not, I know science fiction publishing is doing okay, but you know, journalism, content creation, copywriting, all of these things are being squeezed by AI right now. And just this week, Sam Altman was on stage at a TED Talk. I think it was like Chris Anderson was interviewing him and he asked him a very like kind of softball question. I don't know if you guys saw that. Maybe we can play the clip here. And he was just like, I asked ChatGPT to make a funny comic strip and it basically like shot out a Peanuts cartoon strip. And he's like, some people might say that this looks like, you know, IP theft. And the crowd was like, oh, and the crowd like sort of then clapped for Chris Anderson bringing it up. And Sam Altman was literally just like, feel free to clap right now. Enjoy it while you can, basically. We could play this clip, but I think the room just was like, ooh, even like tech guy sociopathy, this was a new level. Just like, I'm done caring about this stuff because we're chewing it up into our machine for profit while we're doing every single one of those things that you're talking about, Annalise.
So that's really interesting. We don't know. Isn't there though, like at first glance, this looks like IP theft. Like, you guys don't have a deal with the Peanuts estate or?
You can clap about that all you want. Enjoy. I will say that I think the creative spirit of humanity is an incredibly important thing.
Well, Yeah, laugh while you can, because soon the audience will be entirely comprised of ChatGPT agents that are like emitting laughter that's been recycled from like 100 years of laugh tracks or whatever. So
then they will totally have the responses that Sam Altman wants. I wanted to pick up on that point that you were making a little earlier, Annalee, around like the propaganda piece and the use of propaganda, right? Because I feel like there's one piece of this conversation where, you know, we talk about how Elon Musk has been inspired by science fiction and is trying to realize those sorts of things as actual futures. And I'm not denying that that's there, right? I think that's one piece of it. But I feel like there's also this element of the tech industry using science fiction to try to justify futures that they would want to realize regardless. And, you know, that work in their interests, that, you know, benefit themselves and their vision of what the world should be, and then take, you know, these science fiction stories that we have or aesthetics or whatever, and say, look, it aligns with this thing that we've been told that we should have or should want to have. And for this reason, you need to be okay with our labor abuses at Tesla, or, you know, the way that we're disregarding the environment in Texas in order to do what SpaceX is doing. I wonder if you could both kind of maybe talk about that element too, like the kind of deceptive use of science fiction in that way, regardless of whether people actually care about the whole science fiction story and realizing it and what have you.
It feels very much like 500 years ago, these guys would be quoting the Bible. You know, and they would just be like, well, there's a story in the Bible that says that this is cool, you know? And so I think we started out by talking about how Elon Musk is kind of appealing to this geek authenticity. And authenticity is about having a shared culture and having shared norms and shared stories and aspirations. And so by calling on these familiar memes, these familiar images, it's a way of saying like, listen, we're all on the same page here. We all agree that this is where we should be headed. You know, there's going to be some burps along the way, but we're all going toward this shared vision. And so I think that's what's really powerful. And I think that's also why oftentimes the science fiction that's being called on is older, like stuff from the 50s, like the Foundation series, which is so formative for Elon Musk and for lots of other people in the tech community as well. So I think it's an appeal to our collective beliefs as nerds.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I do think it's about vibes. It's about vibes more than about substance. Annalee and I did this series for Our Opinions Are Correct a year or two ago called Silicon Valley versus Science Fiction, where we sort of went through and looked at some of these big science fiction ideas and how Silicon Valley either just misunderstood them or kind of misappropriated them or kind of made them into something dark and terrible, like the whole Torbit Nexus idea, but like also on some other levels, just like all these things that nobody really wanted, but that, you know, and I think that is the thing is like, if your product design, if your marketing, if your, you know, if all of that is driven by, we want things to conform to this image that we saw as kids, not we want this to be products that people are actually going to want and find useful. I think that that's where you start to run into trouble. And honestly, when we did that series, I spent a lot of time, I think we both spent a lot of time thinking about what are the science fiction works that really influence these people. And it's like, okay, they talk about Asimov, they talk about all these other things. Really, when you get down to it, the science fiction book that they're most actually influenced by is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. That's their touchstone. That's their actual
Have you ever read
science
that
fiction.
book?
I've seen all 3 movies based on it, which I highly recommend. Highly recommend those. Get a tub of popcorn. Have it just take a weekend.
Like 4 hours long.
They're like, it's like, it would be like, I think the whole thing is probably 9 hours. They're like probably a few hours each. Just like set aside 9 hours. I love those. I unironically love those movies. They are so great.
I question the unironically part of that
fact
sentence.
that each of them has like a different cast. Like they changed the cast for each movie in the trilogy. And like they're very tonally, like they just tonally are all over the place. At times they're incredibly campy. At times they're actually kind of sweet. I don't know. It's a very rich trilogy, but you know,
I actually read Atlas Shrugged at a very impressionable age when I was like late teens, early, and I think it was like the thing that like definitively I was like I could, this has turned me completely off from conservatism forever.
Oh
like
God.
I cannot. I remember sitting there and closing the book, and like the end of the book is that like the capitalists are all sitting around as the world's burning, and she like traces a dollar sign on like a perch watching the world burn, and like the mighty dollar will like arise out of this. I'm like, it's just like repulsive. dead.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. And I love that line, Annalee, about how, that they're treating this stuff as like, a religious text. And it's true to another point you were talking about where like the meaning is flattened too. Like it's not like the actual sort of like we've done a Bible study and we've like literally sort of gleaned the true message and the many different sort of, ways to approach this parable. It's just like the thing that politicians say on TV version of it. So that's how they're like deploying that sci-fi as well. So I know you guys got to go soon, but just to sort of segue off, we talked about, it's just been such an illuminating conversation. Thanks so much for joining us. But we were hoping that you could speak a few words on sort of just the general meaning of science fiction and sort of its power and what we might be, sort of take away from it or how we might hold on to it at this moment where we've got the pedal down on the fascist express and things are looking bleak. We've touched on many different ways to imagine futures and that science fiction contains multitudes, but I'm wondering if you're thinking about this at all right now and what you might have to share about that.
Two things I really take from science fiction, in addition to all the stuff I talked about before with like hope punk and solar punk and we all gonna build alliances and work together and all that stuff. I think two things I really take from science fiction are a sense of skepticism about technology specifically. To me, good science fiction is willing to ask hard questions. And there's this quote I always go back to of like, okay, science fiction predicts the car, but like great science fiction predicts the traffic jam. Anybody can predict, we're going to have cars, they're going to go down roads. But like, can you predict that there's going to be traffic jams and pedestrian fatalities and all the other problems that come with cars? That's a really important quote in the history of science fiction that's been attributed to a bunch of people. It's probably from Frederick Pohl. Point is, science fiction is not uncritically just like gaga about technology. Science fiction is skeptical about technology. That's the heart of science fiction. And the other thing I'm just going to take from science fiction is that the future is always weirder than we could possibly imagine. And to me, that's a very good thing. That's especially a good thing in this day and age where like the worst people seem to think that they know exactly what the future is going to be like. And I'm just sitting here going like, joke's on you. The future is going to be incredibly weird in ways that are going to probably make me really uncomfortable, but also it's going to be weird in ways that are going to make you fuckers. I don't know if I'm allowed to say fuckers.
Yes,
you
can say
fuckers. It's going to make you fuckers like lose your shit because you can't own the future. You can't control the future. You cannot predict the future. The future is going to be fucking weird.
Yeah, right on. I would just add to that I think science fiction reminds us that the future can be lots of different things at the same time too. And I think that's one of the things that these like totalizing, like oligarchic dudes always forget is that the world is full of many different social configurations. Different nations, different communities have very different ideas about truth and about progress. And as Charlie said, you can't control it. And the future is going to be the same. Like there's going to be many different narratives unfolding simultaneously, and we're going to weave between them, and we're not going to be able to predict which one becomes dominant. And in fact, even thinking about the idea of one particular type of future becoming dominant, that's incorrect thinking, right? Because there's never a truly dominant form of culture. There's just people who think that their culture is the best and think it should be dominant, but they're always incapable of fully making that happen. And I think where I would want to leave us is that one of the things that we often forget about science fiction and speculative fiction generally is it's also there to provide comfort, especially in times when systemic injustice and systemic fear are eroding our ability to think in a kind of coherent and clear way about what we need to do. It's really important to have stories that you can go to that just give you a safe place psychologically to kind of reconstitute and like remember what we're trying to do all of this stuff for. We're trying to get to a place where there's a bit more justice in the world. And when we forge alliances instead of making war, that's hard to remember when your union is being crushed or your job is under threat or your kid is being told they can't go by the name they want to go by at school. But that is the thing. And like, I don't think there's anything wrong with reading and watching or playing science fiction for comfort. Like comfort is super important, and it's actually very subversive because the leaders of this country want us to be terrified and scared and on edge all the time. So if we find comfort, that's something that can push back against them.
I love that so much. And I think it's such a great place for us to leave this conversation. Annalee, Charlie, thank you both so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. We're big fans, like we said. So this was a good crossover universe that we created.
the feeling is so mutual. Please, let's do it again sometime. But everybody, Charlie Jane, Annalee, get their books, listen to their podcast, read their stories. I do think, like you said, it's such an important time to be turning to these things that not only hold ideas with kernels of the future that can be nurtured, but again, just to spend some time with them, feeling safe, feeling powerful, maybe even at a time when we need to. So thank you so much for all those wise words. This was so great. We got to do it again sometime.
System Crash is hosted by Paris Marks and Brian Merchant. Production is by Eric Wickham. Our theme music is Dystopia by our good friends in Yacht. Support the show on patreon.com/systemcrashpod to get a monthly bonus episode.